Hello there, DVC here. Desmos is a graphing calculator that can do this, and this, and this. Wait, Desmos can do that? That's right, I've collected knowledge from all over the internet to show you how you can make full-length songs in Desmos. There are timestamps for the different sections if you need to reference a specific topic, and I will provide a few graphs in the description so you can just copy what I've already typed. The first thing you need is some MIDI values that you can reference, as well as a rest note and a function to convert MIDI to frequency. Note that I use capital letters for the white keys on a piano and lowercase letters for the flat black keys. We also want a user interface. We set up play, pause, and restart buttons, as well as a loop toggle if you want your song to loop. Next, we set up the rhythm control folder. You can set the BPM to whatever value you like. The beat variable serves as the metronome of the graph, since it's a whole number on the on beat of a quarter note. Speaking of, this was made for a 4/4 time signature, so if your song uses 6/8 time, for example, you'll want to multiply the beat by 2. If your song is in half time, you'll want to divide the beat by 2. The next parameter is section length. For a high-tempo song in 4/4, I recommend a section length of 32 quarter notes. If your song is in 3/4 or 6/8, you'll want something like 24 or 48. But if your song is more repetitive, or changes less frequently, you may want longer sections. Technically, you could make the song one long section, but I recommend breaking it up into smaller sections to facilitate adding new tracks. If you change the length of the song, remember to change the number of sections, or end sections. In my case, I have 12 sections. Beat loop is the same as beat, except it returns to 0 once all the sections are finished. This is what allows the song to loop. If you disable loop in the user interface, this will continue to increase just like beat. The B function is essential for making songs, and I'll explain it later. I also include a volume function, which by default sets everything to 1/4 of the maximum allowed volume. I do this so that once you have many instruments, you can multiply an instrument's volume by up to 4 to make it stand out. How you use it is you simply put the volume function into the gain half of the tone and plug in the frequency. Finally, I include two lists. The first one is the integers from 1 to 16, and the other is the odd integers from 1 to 31. These will be used later to create sawtooth waves, square waves, and triangle waves. Now for the most important part of the song, the notes. Because of how lists work in Desmos, you'll need to create unique lists for each track or harmony. To create a list, look through the sheet music of the song and locate the note of the shortest duration. As you can see in this part of a song I'm making, the shortest duration is a 16th note. Since we know that there are 16 16th notes for every 4 quarter notes, and because our sections are 32 notes long, that means that there will be 128 notes in this list. Similarly, if the shortest duration is a half note, we divide the duration of a half note by 4 and multiply it by 32 to get 16 notes in the list. Again, if your section length is not 32, you'll have to do the math for your section length. To make sure you're adding the correct notes, I recommend using a tone player like this. What it does is take the last note of the list you selected and play it. Make sure you're unmuted and that your last input into the list is not a comma, otherwise you won't hear anything. We do the same for percussion, except instead of note names, we simply write 1s for on and Rs for off. Here you can see a little optimization you can do. If your instrument plays the same string of notes over and over again, you can replace the full list with what's repeated. This kick drum plays the same rhythm every measure, so I only need to write the 8 eighth notes. Similarly, the hi-hat plays straight eighth notes, so I only need to write the 1, 1. Before you move on to other strings of notes, however, make sure to define the instrument. How this works is you use the B function to input the name of the list of notes, followed by the duration of each note in terms of quarter notes. Since eighth notes are half of a quarter note, I input 1/2. For the bass line, each note is a half note, which is twice the length of a quarter note, so I input 2. What the B function does is it takes the floor of the beat divided by the note length modulo the length of the list. Then we add 1. What this accomplishes is it outputs sequential integers from 1 to the length of the list, and then repeats, allowing Desmos to read notes from our lists one after another. The function uses what's in the square brackets to pick out the right note from the list you selected. In short, you input the list and the note duration, and it pops out the right note at the right time, in sync with the BPM. Since all the B function does is output values from a list, and the values are just MIDI numbers, we need to convert those values into audible frequencies. That's what the pitch function is for. For the percussion instruments, there's no need to convert between MIDI and frequency, since all we did is input the number 1, or a rest. Because the note lists are just lists of MIDI numbers, we can add integers to transpose the notes. I originally wrote this song in C minor, but decided to transpose the whole thing up 3 half steps to the key of E flat minor. Instead of rewriting hundreds of notes, all I need to do is add 3 before the list, and we're good. If you want to go down instead of up, I recommend adding a negative number to the front instead of going all the way to the end of the list and subtracting that value. That way, you will always see if the list is transposed without having to scroll all the way to the right. Speaking of transposing, I'll show you later how to make key changes. But first, we need to start the song. To avoid being blasted with sound as soon as you unmute Desmos, I included this start value. It's undefined when the play value is at 0, otherwise, it's 1. Next, we define the sections. Here in section 1, I have one instrument that will play for 32 bars, and the other instruments will keep on playing. Since I don't like repeating myself by placing the same exact part in following sections, I've instead defined section 1, sections 1 through 3, and sections 1 through 5. Since instrument definitions repeat their list from the start, instruments will loop back to the beginning and continue playing until the defined section is over. If we look at any of these section definitions, we can see that when beat loop is between 0 and some multiple of the section length, it outputs start. This tells Desmos during which sections a tone will play. Note that 0 is less than or equal to the beat loop. This is important for a seamless loop. Looking at the next section, we see the same structure, but with 0 replaced with the section length. This is because we want section 2 to play after the first section length, and until the second section length is over. Similarly for section 3, we want the music to play once section 2 ends, and until section 3 ends. In short, the inequality should be from the section before you want to play, until the last section you want to play. Now instead of the section equaling start like we did in section 1, subsequent sections will always be after the song has started, so all we have to do is define it as 1. No need to type s_tart every time, when you only need to do it for the sections that start from the beginning. The beauty of this system is that we only define the sections to be 1 when it's time for that section to play, meaning that while other sections are playing, it's undefined. This means we can simply multiply a tone's volume by the section, and that tone will start playing during the defined sections and stop playing when it's over. Now we're ready to actually start playing music. I'm going to take one of the instruments, copy it, paste it into the frequency half of the tone function, copy the section into the gain half, and we're done. Now we just need to press play. Now that I've added a few instruments, it's time to make them sound different. The tone function plays a sine wave at the given frequency and gain, but what if you multiply the frequency by a list? That's right, you get multiple frequencies. Sawtooth waves are made by summing a frequency multiplied by the positive integers n with gains 1 over n. In other words, we can multiply the frequency by saw and divide the gain by saw to create a sawtooth. But I bet you saw square to find as well. Well, we can do the same thing with square to create a square wave. Multiply the instrument by square, and divide the section by square. But I promised triangle waves. Where's that defined? Well, as it just so happens, and also by definition, triangle waves are the same frequencies as a square wave, but with gains 1 over n squared. So, to get a triangle wave, keep the frequency the same, but square the square in the denominator of the gain. If you just want to have a certain set of frequencies, you can simply multiply the frequency by any list of frequencies you desire. Here I have the fundamental and an octave higher. It will be helpful to remember that octaves are powers of 2, so if I wanted 4 octaves of notes, I'd type 1, 2, 4, 8. It's time to set up the percussion. Percussion is not as easy to implement as the 4 basic waveforms, since you can't just hold down bass drum frequencies for a whole quarter note. But let's go over the frequencies first. For the kick drum, I settled on these multipliers, since they sound alright. I then chose a bass frequency of 40. For whatever frequency you choose, place the list first, otherwise Desmos thinks you're trying to index a number with a list and gets confused. For the snare drum, I chose a frequency of 9001. Why this value in particular? Because it's over 9,000. Anyway, I then multiply that by a random function of 50 values. Snare drums and hi-hats are an atonal collection of a lot of frequencies, so I emulate that with this technique. Note that the random function chooses values between 0 and 1, so these two instruments will use the number you multiply them as a maximum, not a minimum. That's how I get away with using 24,000, which is beyond the 20,000 Hz maximum output of the tone function. And just so you know, the lowest output is 20 Hz. For both the snare and hi-hat, I provide a seed for the random function. This is so that the percussion sounds the same each time it plays. I've selected seeds I think fit best, but you can fiddle around with the seed to your liking. In fact, I'm sure it's more efficient to use a different list of numbers, maybe hand-chosen values, but I'm sure one of you will let me know your findings. Earlier, I mentioned key changes. This is achievable by multiplying the instrument by a 12th root of 2. Since I want to go up 2 half steps, I multiply the instrument by 2 to the 2/12, which simplifies to 2 to the 1/6. If I wanted to go down 3 half steps, I'd multiply the instrument by 2 to the -3/12. The envelope control is probably the most advanced setting. Among other things, I use it to get the percussion sounding right. If your percussion is in eighth notes, you can simply copy my settings here and move on. But for those of you who are curious, I'll explain what's going on. The envelope function takes 3 parameters. The first is the BeatMod of the note duration. What BeatMod does is take the beat modulo the note duration. Recall that the beat value increases from 0 to infinity as the song continues. Taking the modulus means the result will go from 0 to the value you provide, in this case 1/2 for an eighth note, and then repeat. So, throughout a 4-beat measure, this BeatMod will go from 0 to 1/2 8 times. And this one here will do so 4 times. You could even plug in 1/3 to get quarter note triplets, or other fractions for the other tuplets. The other 2 parameters are seen in this equation here, intersect and exponent. What this messy looking function does is, for positive values of intersect, output 1 when x is 0, and output 0 when x is the intersection. In between, you can adjust the curve. Watch as I change the intersection input. Right now the exponent is 1, so the gain will linearly decrease to 0. But you can change this to a value greater than 1 to decrease faster. Or you could change it to a value lower than 1 to decrease slower, and then suddenly drop off. Setting the exponent to 0 allows you to set staccato notes. Normally, having a negative intersection would be unhelpful, since the BeatMod function only outputs non-negative values. But I did a little tinkering to the restrictions to give some use to the negative sign. My song, over time, has some instruments that increase in volume to give the effect of sounding reversed. So when the intersect value is negative, it starts at 0 and gradually increases to 1. With these 2 features, you can create crescendo and decrescendo to your instruments. In this case, I made a decrescendo for the whole section, 32 quarter notes. To keep things simple, the y-intercept will either be 0 or 1, meaning the tone you apply it to will either be muted or max, but you do have full control of how the tail of the envelope closes. In the case of the kick drum, I set the intersection to a quarter note even though the BeatMod repeats every eighth note. This means when BeatMod reaches 1/2, the output is at 25% gain instead of 0. Alternatively, for the decrescendo, I set intersect to a value smaller than the BeatMod, meaning the envelope function reaches 0 before the section is over. Since E and V outputs values between 0 and 1, you can multiply 2 together to get advanced dynamics. For the bass, this part here creates a drop-off, but this part here is a crescendo. Combined, you get this effect. But that's not all the envelope function can do. I also utilize it to change the frequency for the percussion instruments. This is what they sound like without the frequency envelopes. And this is what they sound like with the envelopes. There's definitely room for improvement with the percussion envelopes, including making separate ones for the frequency and gain, but that's for you guys to improve upon. Going back to BeatMod, you may have noticed it takes 2 inputs. The first is the shortest note duration, and the second is the delay, or offset. Usually I set this to 0, but in this instance, it is very powerful. If we look at the sheet music of this song, there's a guitar part that plays an eighth note, followed by 2 dotted eighth notes, and then repeats. Since guitars have a distinctive sound when the strings are strummed, I needed a way to separate the envelopes for each played note. This is what I came up with. We can see that BeatMod repeats every 2 quarter notes for each of these envelopes. The first note has an offset of 0, meaning it plays at the beginning of each half note. The second note has an offset of 1/2 of a quarter note, or 1/8. And the last one has an offset of 5/4, or an eighth followed by a dotted eighth, just like in the sheet music. I then added intersects and exponents that sounded good. If we look at the notes, I don't need to write in all the 16th note fractions, since the pitches are the same throughout the half note duration. Plus, the song repeats the first 4 measures for the last 4. Hence, I only need the first 8 half notes. Also, since the sheet music has a root note, a fifth above, and an octave above, I can define one of the instruments by multiplying the pitch by a list of 1 and 2, which is an interval of an octave. Now for the grand finale, the visualization. Just for the fun of it, I decided to define specific colors for each of the instruments, as well as a black background. Bloop! To animate the waves moving to the right, I use this phase value here, which completes a 2π cycle every quarter note, but you can set this to be however many beats you desire. The next variable is resolution. This is adjustable to your x-axis range. I currently have it set to negative to positive 10, so the resolution is also 10. You can set this lower if you have performance issues. Similarly, there's the precision variable. I have it set to 4, and this dictates the precision of the square and sawtooth waves. At 1, these are just sine waves. At 20, they're pretty darn close to perfect waves. Unfortunately, I couldn't get Desmos to run the simulation of the oscilloscope along with playing the song properly at this precision. Finally, there's frequency. This sets how dense the width of the waves are. You can tweak this for different screen resolutions in Zoom. This is the basic anatomy of a visualized sine wave. All in curly brackets, you've got your range here, negative res is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to positive res, colon, the sine of the frequency variable times the instrument times x minus phase. This is all multiplied by the section during which the instrument plays. Recall that the section variable outputs 1 during the section and undefined otherwise, so you'll have to create a separate function for non-consecutive sections. Finally, you can see this plus 0. This is the vertical displacement from the x-axis. When you start adding multiple waves that play at the same time, you need to set each of them to separate y levels at multiples of 2. So if I want to copy above, I need to set the displacement to positive 2. If I want to copy below, I need to set it to negative 2. When your instrument has an envelope affecting it, you can just multiply the whole main function by its respective envelope function, in this case E sub bass. In my song, the low bass instrument is actually 2 sine waves an octave apart. Rather than type out both separately, I use the sum function, which you can get by typing SUM. This will be useful for other waveforms. In front of the sum, divide the sum by how many total frequencies you have, otherwise the amplitude will cause the wave to overlap with the waves above and below. This doesn't work for large values of n, however. Then I multiply the whole sum by the envelope function. Remember to keep the vertical displacement out of any parentheses, but within the curly brackets. The triangle wave is just like the sine wave, except you nest the sine function in the arcsine function and multiply it by 2 over pi. Now say you want to combine 2 or more sine waves or triangle waves. Here's how you do it. Define a new track as a list of 2 or more instruments. Then, total the waveforms you want to combine. If you want to combine, say, a sine wave with a triangle wave, you'll have to type both out explicitly. Then, divide the amplitude by the number of instruments. In my case, I can simplify. I don't recommend combining sawtooth or square waves, since that drastically diminishes performance. Speaking of square waves, let's talk about sawtooth. This is the equation. You take 2 over pi times the sum from 1 to the precision variable of the sine of n times the middle part you're now familiar with, all over n. Of course, you also include the section and y value, as well as any envelope if you desire. Finally, the most visually interesting waveform, the square wave. It's similar to sawtooth in a couple ways, with key differences. Firstly, there's no 2 over pi term. Secondly, n is replaced with 2n minus 1 in parentheses. This is because, while the sawtooth uses every harmonic from 1 to infinity, the square wave uses only the odd harmonics. If you plug in 1 for n, you get 1, the fundamental. If you plug in 2, you get 3. Then you get 5, 7, etc. In terms of organization, I have a naming convention for the different lists so I don't go crazy. Firstly, almost everything is in Pascal case, meaning I capitalize the beginning of each word for legibility. The only things I don't capitalize are the variable parameters in function definitions, so I don't confuse them for variables I defined myself. The list of notes are simply called the name of the part, arpeggio, bass, high part, etc. I give the part a number according to the section in which it first appears to avoid confusion with different parts that otherwise have the same name. If a melody has multiple voices, like playing an interval or chord, I label the parts A, B, C, etc. I recommend lettering the parts in ascending frequency. So if I'm going to add a part playing 3-note chords in section 2, I'd label it chord 2, A through C, with A being the lowest note and C being the highest note. I wish I had done this from the start, but I was figuring everything out and probably renamed things 3 or 4 times. For the instrument definitions, I use I sub name. There aren't a lot of instruments that start with the letter I, so when I see I know it's a defined instrument. Similarly, when I group instruments into tracks, I use T to denote it's a list of instruments. Going back up to the envelopes, I use a capital E to denote a defined envelope function. My last tip about organizing your graph is to define something above what you're using it for. For example, I define the notes, which the instrument definitions depend on, and then that with the envelope control are used for the wave visualization and tone sections. I never define something below and use it above. That way, if I need to delete something, I can always start deleting from the bottom of the list and make my way up. And just a useful Desmos feature, you can copy an expression by just clicking in the text box and hitting Ctrl-C. The advantage of this is it copies not only the text, but also the color of the equation. It's also helpful when copying a long list of notes, since you don't have to drag your cursor all the way to the right to copy the data. The final thing I'll cover is color. You can define a color like I've done with a capital C and then a color name, followed by an RGB value. But you can also use HSV. The benefit of using HSV is you can do a little magic trick, also known as math, to make the hue change in time with the music. The result is this. Cool, huh? Fancy? Amazing even? All of the above. Well, that's everything. Or almost everything. There are some things I tried to implement that didn't work for one reason or another, but the coolest one has got to be this one. This single equation is enough to cause the tones to stutter, so I wasn't able to include it, but I thought it was worth showing. If you have any questions, leave a comment. In the description, I will leave my song, a graph with explanations and examples of everything, and a graph with only the bare essentials. I'm excited to see what cool songs you make using nothing but a graphing calculator.